Hey guys, welcome back for another FBC Okeechobee podcast. And how's your day been so far?
Pretty good.
Wonderful, wonderful. Let's jump in. Let's see
Okay,
what we can
let's
talk
go.
about here. We're still in Mark chapter 6. And this is a kind of a sad part of the Gospels here because this is the death of John the Baptist. It kind of recounts what had happened to him. And the way Mark does this is interesting because when you look at verses 14, 15, and 16, it talks about like it was in the past. Like Herod was scared that Jesus was John the Baptist risen, come back to get him. And then in verse 17, it kind of tells the story of how John the Baptist died. So it's very interesting.
So he's already dead, but this is the story of how he
Yeah. I mean, let's look at verse 14 through 16, and it really leans into it. And this verse picks up speaking about some of the things Jesus and the disciples were doing. It says, and King Herod heard of it, for his name had become well known, and people were saying, John the Baptist has risen from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others were saying he is Elijah, and others were saying he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he kept saying, John, whom I beheaded, has risen. So you see, it's giving you this, it's
a little guilty conscience there.
Yeah, it's almost like, a movie, where you see the end and the main character sitting there and then he's all sad and he goes away and tells the story of how he got there.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what we get
I
here.
don't like those parts, but
You don't like those parts? I find those parts to be
okay.
entertaining. I don't mind them. That's just me. But anyway, you didn't see me.
Sorry.
You're done. You're done with that. So this King Herod was put on this throne by the Emperor Augustus. Mm-hmm. And Herod was not a guy that anybody really liked. And this king title was very strange because he wasn't really a king in the way that we think of David or Solomon or somebody like that being king.
More of a figurehead?
Yeah, he was a figurehead. He did have authority over the region, but it all came under the emperor and the Senate of Rome. It all came underneath them. There was none of that stuff. Like, he wasn't autonomous anyway. As a matter of fact, Augustus did not even really give him the title of king. He hounded Augustus about it, and he winds up offending the emperor's court, and it's a sad story. I'll save that for the end, but it's a sad story kind of even what happens to him at the end of the day.
Really?
Yeah. So, but save that to the end. So you got to finish watching this to know what happened to Herod.
Or at the end of this one, because you know
Yes.
how we don't.
That's true. We'll see what we get to.
Very far.
If you don't find out this week, you have to come back next week to figure it out. I mean, that's what's going to happen.
Cliffhanger.
So they were saying he was from different people. John the Baptist resurrected. This is Jesus. Elijah, or one of the prophets of old. And that's pretty much what even the disciples, and this rolls along with that, when Jesus asked them, who do you say, who am I? Who do people say that I am? And he said, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're a prophet. And then Peter pipes in and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so...
Meaning Messiah,
Yes.
who had been foretold.
Yes. Peter's embracing him and saying, you are the Messiah. That's who you are. You're the guy that we've been waiting on since Genesis chapter 12.
But did they recognize the Messiah as, because I know a lot of Jews think that the Messiah will be a man. Like Jews today, a lot of them think that he'll be a man. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. You've done more study on the Jewish interpretation of the Messianic prophecies than I have.
And that's the same reason why they thought that he would set up an earthly kingdom.
Yes, they definitely thought he would set up an earthly kingdom right up until the end. I mean, it was right up to the end that they were still going earthly kingdom, restoring the throne of David, which the Bible talks about. I mean, we've been studying on Sunday nights in our classic worship service at 6 on Sunday nights. We've been studying the book of Zechariah, which really digs a lot into messianic prophecies. And it talks about both his first coming and second coming. And in the second coming, it talks about the dynasty of David. Like we were reading last night, we were reading through chapter 13. And it literally talks about, in verse 1, it refers to the dynasty of David, the throne of David. And so the Jews weaved all that together and didn't separate the first coming from the second coming. They didn't get that. And so neither did the disciples really until after the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. And then they went, oh, wait, we get it now. And they understood after that.
I don't think I understand what you're saying, because
Which part?
The first coming, you mean Christ?
Yes,
here?
the first coming of Christ here. Yes. When he came, as he's
So how were they
described,
not separating?
They kind of put it all together and leaned really heavily into the second coming.
Oh, because of the earthly kingdom.
Yes.
Because in the second coming, he will bring a new kingdom.
Yes,
to earth.
and
Okay.
like they talk the throne of David. Jerusalem's the center of everything.
I think that can be confusing for people, because
I
we
do
talk
too.
so much too about how we're going to go to heaven.
Yeah.
And really, though, if you have to understand Revelations to
Yes,
really
which is
understand
a
the second
very
coming,
difficult book to understand.
And just realize it's funny when you actually read through it and you realize that no, we're not going to spend eternity in heaven. We're going to be on the new earth with Christ as He reigns, and that's not typical culture to say. I mean, I don't know why we.
Revelation is such a difficult book to deal with, to interpret, to handle, that I think there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the book of Revelation. And maybe someday I'll teach through that. It wouldn't be something I would do on a Sunday morning, probably, especially digging into a lot of the symbolism stuff. I think it would be. I like to do something like that in a discussion format where people can do it in a smaller group and sit down and discuss and talk through it and be able to ask questions, because there's so many moving parts. So I would do something like that, but I don't know if I would ever do that on like a Sunday morning. Go through all of the book of Revelation. Naturally, you're going to reference pieces and parts and
it is difficult.
do that. But to go verse by verse through Revelation, I don't know if I would do that on a Sunday morning. But that's just me.
Yeah, I don't know.
You know, maybe someday the Lord changed my mind and says, this is what I want you to do. And I'll be
knows?
like, well, here's what we're going to do, guys.
Who knows?
Let's jump on
I mean,
board.
He always does interesting things that we aren't expecting. Obviously, because like you said, they expected Him to come and the Messiah would set up an earthly kingdom. But He's just knocking down expectations right and left. Because that's who He is. He is different from us. He has different thoughts and motives and understanding.
Well, the first time was that suffering servant. And the second time is that Lion of the tribe of Judah. And I see from reading in the Old Testament, especially as we've been studying through Zechariah, which has been a really interesting book for me to study through and learn more myself. You know, it's a book that I had read, but I had never studied through it on the level of like teaching it, preaching from it. Because, you know, you dig in a lot deeper than you do maybe, you know, just reading and understanding the story and the context and what's happening. There's a deeper level that you dig in. You know that from the times you've prepared to teach things. You always dig so much deeper. And so it's been fascinating, and I can see where the Jews could intermingle some of those things.
I definitely see, because they're not, we see in hindsight, but they were trying to, it's like when we
they're trying to look ahead.
Yeah, it's like when we try to read Revelations and it's so confusing and we can only speculate in some areas. That's what they were having to do.
Yeah. But I mean, some of the most interesting, you know, there's places in Zechariah that speak about how the nation of Israel pierced Him. And it's very interesting. And then it goes right into talking about right before His second coming and the nation of Israel being saved by the return of the Messiah. It's really, really interesting. And so, you know, I think that there's been confusion about who Christ is forever, going back to the Old Testament with that coming into when the incarnation on earth. And even today, there's all kind of different thought processes about Christ.
That's why, I mean, I guess it still depends on who you're talking to, I guess. Like when I say that, in general, Jews might believe that the Messiah is going to come as a man, But in the Old Testament, like you said, in the like in Genesis, when they saw Christ in Genesis, they believed that he was God, and so they saw God in human form.
Yes. Joshua falls down and worships him, falls down before him, like bows before him.
Right.
In Joshua chapter 1.
So that's why it's, I don't know, like when you say that he says you are the Christ, the Son of God.
I think he believed he was deity. That's what Peter believed right there. Because that phrase "son of," and I talked about this last night.
Yeah.
That phrase "son of" is so important for us to understand
how they viewed it,
how the Jews viewed it versus how we view it. In that we view it as the son is not to be the same as the father, but for them to be the son of someone was to be of the same kind and substance as that individual. So if you were the Son of God, that meant you were the same substance as God, which meant you were God.
And he accepted that explanation as correct, and he wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, he said, it's not man who showed you this, but my Father. So he absolutely, Peter got a high five for that one. Peter stuck his foot in his mouth a lot of times, but for that one, it was a high five. Good job, Peter. Like, you figured this out. You got this right. And then that's what we see all of them teaching afterwards in the book of Acts. That's what we see them teaching as they write with people like Peter, Paul, James, John. That's what we see constantly. We see him presenting like Matthew in Matthew's gospel. That's how he presents Christ. So all of the disciples understood that, and that's the route they went. So they understood who Christ was. And so, there was this back and forth at this point about him. And Herod thought he was John who had risen. I get why he thought that. He felt really guilty about what he had done.
Yeah.
And as we look down, you'll see why and how Herod felt about this. But he naturally thinks the worst thing because this man's walking around with a guilty conscience, a high-level guilty conscience. Because when you continue down in verses 17 through 29, and I'm not going to read all of those verses, but Herod had John arrested and had him bound in prison because of his wife Herodias, who was also the wife of his brother Philip, who he had married, right? And so he married Herodias, and John called foul. John said, this is not right. John was one of those guys, I put him in the fire and brimstone category. John preached hard. John suffered no fools. And John said it just like it was, point blank, in your face. You're talking about a guy that was out in the woods eating locusts and honey. He's eating crickets and grasshoppers for dinner. He don't really care what you think. He's walking around wearing these camel skin clothes. He was a wild man. He was a different kind of cat. And so he confronted him about this. And Herodias hated him. And she wanted him put to death. But verse 20 tells us, for Herod was afraid of John, knowing he was a righteous, holy man, and he kept him safe. So he arrested him, but had him guarded and actually kept him from being killed. Because Herodias wanted him dead. Because she didn't want anybody saying anything bad about her, even if it was true. John was just telling him the truth. And the relationship between Herod and John were interesting. It continues there in verse 20. It says, and when he heard him, he was very perplexed, but he used to enjoy listening to him. So Herod kind of liked John. Here's what I think.
And I think that doubles the guilt too.
Yeah, he genuinely, I think, liked him, and he was interested in what he had to say. I think Herod was kind of at a place where Herod knew he was wrong in this, and he knew John was right, but he wasn't willing to do anything about it.
And he had already taken so many steps down the road that he was living, and it was easier to continue and take that next step.
Yeah.
And it was easier to sin again than it was to step back and pull away from.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's interesting. You don't see a lot of folks in Herod's position deal with somebody like John in this way. It's interesting. It's obvious he respected him, and you see what he says there. He knew he was a righteous and holy man. He knew who John was, that John was the real deal.
You know what it reminds me of, though, and you might disagree, but it reminds me of David and how he got entangled with this sin, and he didn't want to kill Uriah, but it was easier to do that and continue to sin than it was to back away from it.
Yeah. Now, the difference being, when he was confronted by his version of John the Baptist being the prophet Nathan, when Nathan confronted him with that awesome story about the sheep, how there was one guy that had all these sheep, and yet he took this man had one sheep, and he took that sheep from him and stole it. And David was like, oh, who is this guy? We're going to take him out. This guy's going to get punished. And Nathan's like, it was you. And instead of having Nathan arrested or beheaded, which he could have done, David could have said, hey, by the way, lop his head off for me. And they would have chopped Nathan's head off in a second. No questions asked. Yeah. That's how the absolute right of monarchs was. But David instead confessed his sin.
And that's what God loved about him, was his humbleness and his repentance. And I think that wherever we are, I don't know, I can relate to the idea that it's difficult for your sin to come out in the open and want to hide it and continue to sin more and more rather than confess or to confront it. But it's going to catch up to us eventually. Yeah,
John's sin was, not John, Herod's sin, I can't get his name straight. Herod's sin was out in front of everybody. I mean, everybody saw this and knew this. And because of Herod's position, John was the only one with the gumption to say anything, because he's like, I don't care. I'll say the truth. And so he told the truth when nobody else would.
David also didn't have, Bathsheba wasn't in his ear telling him, do this, do this, do this.
No. Herodias was a really bad influence on him.
Yeah, and I think that's another cautionary tale for all of us, is that whoever we surround ourselves with, whether that's through marriage and or friendships, it makes a big difference in our lives. And we need to surround ourselves with people who are going to give us godly wisdom and advice and tell us the hard truths.
Sometimes we need to hear a few of those. I've heard a few of those in my life, and I'll hear a few more before it's over with if I live a little bit longer. So at this point, John is in jail. And then there was a birthday party. It says a day came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you want and I will give it to you. Now, she didn't come in and clog, okay? She wasn't square dancing. This would have been a very seductive type, provocative dance that she does. And so everybody's pleased by this situation in this group. And he says, ask me for anything and I'll give it to you. Him having no idea mom was going to be in the daughter's ear, and she said, ask for the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. Herod did not want to do this.
And there's so many, so there's lust involved here and at the party, and then there's pride in that he announced that to everyone, and then he wouldn't
allow himself to be embarrassed in front of his guests by saying no.
Yeah. And so there are so many things of the flesh that are happening in this story that lead to his death.
Yeah, instead of just looking at her and going, are you out of your mind? I thought you'd ask for some jewelry or something. What's wrong with you? We're not beheading anybody. He wouldn't allow himself to lose face in front of these other dignitaries, because it's obvious from the fact of him wanting that king title so bad from Augustus that he wanted that stature and standing that was really important to him. So I made this declaration. I've got to carry out this declaration. And so he does it.
But there is no way to heaven. There is no way to God through pride. It is only through humility
Mm-hmm.
that we can ever get to the place that we submit to God. Whether it's in front of other people or not, you have to be able to humble yourself. And if you can't come to
Herod
that,
was not a humble guy in any form or fashion. Herodias was not humble either. So we've got a couple of very bold, bombastic, I like that word, bombastic individuals that John got caught up in the middle of. And Herod would not stand up for even what he knew was right, because if you look on down a little further, it says in verse 26, and although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests, he was unwilling to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner commanded to bring back his head. And he went and had him beheaded in the prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples, because John the Baptist had disciples as well, heard about this, they came and took away the body and laid it in a tomb.
That's such a sad story.
It is a sad story.
Especially as I think about John the Baptist too, and all the things that he must have been thinking and feeling as he was in jail.
Mm-hmm. In jail for just simply stating the truth of what was moral and right according to the Word of God.
And like so many prophets before him, I am doing the work of God. I am doing the things that He's telling me to do. Why am I suffering for it? Why is God allowing this?
Yeah. Men like him, men like Joseph, men like Daniel. You know, they went through Paul, who would come later. All of the disciples, you know, they dealt with hard things and dealt with suffering to serve God.
Yeah.
And their reward in heaven is great, you know. Now, to tag on as we kind of wrap this up a little bit, to tag on to the end of the story. Now, Herod had put away his first wife, and she was a princess from a neighboring kingdom to the east. The father was offended and actually came at him with an army.
This isn't in Scripture?
No, this is just history. We know this from history.
Okay.
Came at him with an army and defeated him in battle. Then his brother, Herod Agrippa, who will later be in the book of Acts. Mm-hmm. So you've got the Herod. Herod was like this passed down name. You had Herod the Great. That's the Jesus. That's baby Jesus.
Right.
Then you
Killed
have
the infant.
Yes. Then you have this Herod, and then in the book of Acts you have Herod Agrippa, who's a different Herod. So they were brothers. So he rats his brother out and accuses him of treason, which doesn't really appear to be true. But he rats him out for treason to the Roman emperor, the Senate. And they wind up and they send him to the province of Gaul. Gaul is modern day France. And let's just put it this way, nobody was taking a gondola ride down the rivers, okay? There was the Eiffel Tower was not lit up, and there was no fine French cuisine. That was
a backwoods.
Oh yeah, you just
community.
think like Galilee was backwoods for the Roman Empire. This was the worst of the worst. This was the fringe part, unsettled. This is where the barbarians were from. Mm-hmm. So they were sent there, and Herod and Herodias committed suicide there in Gaul. So Herod's story does not have a nice ending. And at some point, maybe down the road, who knows when, we'll talk about Herod Agrippa and his situation, because it didn't turn out very good either. But
yeah,
it
doesn't seem like most of those people who had authority like that did.
No, it didn't turn out real well.
So she stayed with him then.
Mm-hmm. She left and went with him. And so I guess what else was she going to do at this point?
But they weren't forced to commit suicide. They did that
No,
themselves.
they just committed suicide on their own. So they sent to Gaul and killed themselves. So it's a sad story.
It is.
It is all the way around. But it's such an incredible example of what pride and unrepentant sin will do to us.
Exactly.
And how it affected not
And
only
even
Herod
in
and
the
Herodias,
end, like
but John.
I think that their suicide speaks to that pride also, and
They
non-humility.
couldn't handle being sent where they were.
they couldn't handle being lowered.
Yes. There was this pride within both of them that wound up being a large part of their downfall.
Yeah.
And it's a cautionary tale to us. This passage is really a cautionary tale for how we conduct ourselves and how we deal with the fact that there's sin in our lives and what we do with that and how we deal with it when we're confronted by it, either by the Holy Spirit, the Word of God, through prayer, another person. However that is there, how we deal with that. And it affects so many around us. But not the cheeriest of tales, but a tale nonetheless. A tale nonetheless.
Yeah.
But we appreciate you guys being a part of our podcast today, and we hope to see you again very soon at FBC Okeechobee.